Welcome to the Freckle Weekly Call. We're a group of distribution leads who get together regularly to discuss works in progress, share ideas, and create opportunities for cross-distro collaboration.
All right. Hi, everybody. We are here. It is March 11th, and we are doing a new thing in the Freckle Call. Just a quick recap of where we're at the beginning of the year. A bunch of folks went to FOSDEM. We got into a very collaborative spirit after FOSDEM. We talked about it, a few things of what do we actually want to accomplish. And one of those things was creating some plumbing between Fedora, CentOS, and RHEL at kind of the market problem level. And everyone was pretty enthusiastic about this because it would actually allow us to kind of plan things out end to end, soup to nuts. And while everyone was enthusiastic about that, we didn't know what we wanted to do first until Jeff said, hey, I've got this Sandbox idea that I need to put out there. And that Sandbox idea is now, it's out there, it's on Discourse, and there is a link to it in the agenda. I'm also going to just drop it here into the chat. And the idea for today, I believe, and Scott and Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, is for us to talk about this proposal and talk about what that means as if we want to treat it as a feature of our market problem for how we do things end to end. So I'm going to pause for a second. Jeff, Scott, see if you want to chime in here.
Yeah, I'll give my perspective, because I was in the room for the RHEL 11 planning. I look at this as a feature that came out of a market problem discussion. And I think Scott's the best person to have a discussion about what the market problem definition was. But I look at this as a feature to address a market problem that was basically what I wrote up was inspired by what we said in the room. And it takes it a little further. And now it's a matter of, does it actually, this is a proposed feature to address the market problem, but now we should have a discussion about the market problem with everybody here in the more open respect and see if it still makes sense for everybody as a way to address it. Does that make sense, Scott? I think that makes sense. Scott is on mute, maybe.
Sorry, I was just saying, yes, I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so if everybody would like pull up their emoji button in the middle of the Google Meet, it's the smiley face in the center of the buttons. If you have read this wrong one, Stephen. If you read the Sandbox proposal, would you give me a thumbs up? And if you haven't, a thumbs down. That's a lot of thumbs up. Wow, thank you, everybody. A couple thumbs down, though. So how do we want to kick this off? So currently the agenda's in the invite, but let me just drop it into the chat as well. You should have it because you're here, but there's a link to it if you don't have it. And if anybody is loading this for the first time and you don't have access, let me know and I'll open it up. You should all have access. Okay, so Scott, the idea is treat this as a market problem. Jeff, the idea is let's talk about this idea and applicability in general. How would you like to get started with this?
Well, I think Scott should go back and define the market problem because, like I said, this was a proposal to be a feature to address the market problem, and this rhymes with the thing we said in the room when we had the small group. And now, if we're going to use this process, let's go back, define the market problem, make sure we all agree it's a market problem, right? And then we can look at that, and we can all tear my proposal apart as a way to solve that problem.
Yeah, I agree, Jeff. And I will just give one little piece of background. We've discovered from doing many market problems and features inside of Red Hat that you kind of got to bring them forward as a market problem and a feature pair for them to make any sense. It's like saying, I need a bunch of dirt at my house. And then somebody shows up with like 200 wheelbarrows and you're like, not what I meant. Like, I actually meant use a dump truck. And like if you don't go, yes, bring a dump truck with dirt. And they're like, don't solution this for me. Don't you tell me how to do my job. You know, you have to like you have to like kind of propose both, just a little bit, and then let everybody throw darts at it, and then rework it and be very flexible about how you back up. But yeah, I tend to agree. Like yes, this works quite well comparing it with what has succeeded in my mind before.
Okay, so Scott, with that in mind, is Sandboxes a market problem or an implementation? Is it a feature that solves a market problem?
I think we're using the word for both things. Kind of, we're overloading it, but like I think Jeff, what you propose is basically the feature that would satisfy the market problem, right?
Right.
In the proposal, and then we can kind of reverse engineer as people like or dislike the solution. You can kind of reverse engineer it. There's this massaging process that you got to kind of symbiotically define both of them. That's what I've discovered.
I mean, can you share the JIRA that has the market problem definition for everyone?
I don't know if I could. Like, can I share it live, or could I just say what it is?
Yeah. Say what it is.
Yes. So here, let me actually. Let me try to find it real quick. Yes, I can do that. I will read it actually. Basically, let me read it live because why not? It's like demoing something live. Okay. Here's what we wrote down. As a Red Hat customer, partner, or community contributor, I want clear visibility into the maturity levels of technology within Fedora so that I can anticipate which features will graduate to RHEL and make informed investment decisions. The current Fedora ecosystem mixes experimental hobbyist projects with technologies actively being groomed for RHEL, making it difficult for external observers to predict which features will graduate to the enterprise product. This lack of clarity affects customers, partners' ability. I would also throw in their community members' ability to anticipate future capabilities just in general. Like even if you're a community member building on Fedora or CentOS or RHEL, this applies to all, I would say. Leaving internal engineers unsure about which upstream projects warrant official resource investment and makes it challenging to signal Red Hat's engineering focus to the market. That I think is the key piece, right? Because a bunch of Fedora people get employed by RHEL or Red Hat people, I should say, not even RHEL, all kinds of Red Hat people from all kinds of different products and engineering teams. And just like being able to send a clear signal between the project Fedora and the world at large of like, what are we investing in and why, right? Like, I don't think the Fedora community wants to get trapped into creating roadmaps similar to what I do for RHEL or what our team does for RHEL. But like, I do think you all want a way to communicate like what's important to you all and like what you plan on putting brain power and time and money into. That's kind of the gist of this market problem.
Right. Well, I should provide context. Like, this market problem's in the context of
RHEL
planning, right?
Yeah.
And so my understanding is, so this is the first time like a community-oriented person has been part of that. And I took that market problem, I tried to build a feature proposal that made sense before that, but also could be used for broadly, right? For community interests, for other downstream vendors who want to participate in the innovation like loop, right? That are using Fedora, because it's not just about Fedora is not just about RHEL, but it's in service to stakeholders, right? So my process goes that I stood up makes sense to me as the FPL to build a process that can be a feature to address the market problem in the RHEL sense, as me with my Red Hat and hat on as an employee who got to participate in this discussion, and then also a process that's durable and flexible enough to be useful for other stakeholder interests, right? So that's where I came from this, and hopefully this is close to something we can try and make a space to make it easier to address the maturity concerns from the RHEL point of view, but also for other technologies too.
Okay, we've got a set of hands up, so let's run through that. Like I think we've got a good foundation though. Neil, go ahead.
Yeah, so I heard that this was talking about like the market problem is specifically that there is not a differentiation between, I have it turned on, the differentiation between stuff that Fedora is doing for Fedora versus stuff Fedora is doing for RHEL. And I think that's actually a feature and not a bug. I don't actually want a process where it makes it possible for, through the Fedora vehicle, that Red Hat can communicate its opinion of the enterprisiness of a feature being developed, because the problem with that is that the stuff happening in Fedora can and does change over time, and the only actual valid place for that judgment call to be made is when Red Hat is making Red Hat Enterprise Linux from a Fedora release. There are no other points in time where, from my point of view, it actually makes sense to make that judgment call, because that judgment call will always be outdated relative to what is actually happening within the RHEL space. Now, some of the other bits, I think, like, from my point of view, the way I wanted to see some of this talking about specifically is when we have a larger overarching thing that we in the Fedora community want to do, you know, it's perfectly fine and good for us to break it down into individual changes and do them incrementally. In fact, that's highly desirable. But we don't have an effective way of communicating the big picture. Like, I have had a 10-year-long big picture with 3- and 5-year plans that I've been executing on in Fedora for a very long time. Most people are not even aware that that is a thing. But if anyone asks, I'm happy to tell them. But there's not an effective mechanism to communicate those things. And that's what I feel, that's what I want out of this. I don't really want to make judgment calls about, hey, is this a feature that is good for you or good for a particular subgroup that doesn't really take a feedback loop back in to be influenced, right? Like, it's not supposed to be a one-way thing. So anything we're doing here for Fedora context, I expect it to be always a bi-directional flow rather than something that is unidirectional.
Okay, so we got a big queue of hands now, and I'm not sure if that is the right order, or Scott, if you raised your hand in order to respond to the thing that Neil said.
I just wanted to acknowledge I definitely see that bigger picture thing, and I also think I'm not trying to imply that Red Hat wants to communicate anything in the Fedora space. I think it would be nice to have a set of technology maturity in Fedora so that RHEL has some ideas of what it could pick from Fedora that it wants based on the maturity level, right? And other stakeholders. So, like, David has his hands up. Like, anybody that builds something off Fedora, it would be nice to be like, oh, that's mature, I'll take that. That's a little bit not as mature, I need to more invest some things here. To know how much investment you need to make something more mature. There's all these things that can communicate that I think are valuable.
Oh, yeah, for sure. That makes sense. But I just wanted to address that specific point because it was mentioned as part of the market problem statement that you made.
Yes, these are very fungible market problems.
Okay, Stephen Gallagher, go ahead.
Okay, I had two brief things. One was a quick response to something that Neil said, and then one was my original comment. I'm going to do them in that order, if that's okay. One of the things I think Neil may be referring to, though, is that there has historically been a great deal of pushback from experimenting with certain things in the Fedora space. Things like it took years to get any kind of reasonable support for Btrfs in Fedora because Red Hat put a lot of pressure on not doing that. There's a current effort right now in Fedora ELN to experiment with trying to get hyperscale up and running using ELN extras or something akin to the CentOS SIGs, and we're having some pushback there as well because Red Hat doesn't want the kernel bits in their kernel. So I kind of see where he's coming from, that Red Hat does sometimes squash possible futures because they look at it from on a short-term basis, not a long-term one. So I do want to back him up on that perspective. The other comment I was going to make, and this is more a request for clarification than it is an accusation. The way it has come across a little bit, the way you were describing, Jeff, was that you came up with this plan and then went shopping for a problem that it solves, which is a little bit. And I'm pretty sure that wasn't exactly how it happened, but it's the way you're describing it, and that makes people nervous. So I was going to hope that you could maybe clarify on that a little bit.
All right, Jeff, skip the queue.
No, this was originally intended, right, to address the market problem that we talked about, right? But I know that as Fedora project leader, it has to be, if we're going to implement process in Fedora, it has to be bigger. We have to make it so that it can be used in the way you're talking about just now, making possible futures. We can taste possible futures, right? Create a space where we can attempt to do experimental things without having to hit all the policy requirements up front. And then we basically choose what things are suitable to be fully integrated, right? And in the case of RHEL, there are going to be points where RHEL chooses to exit this process, but still includes it in RHEL, right? There's no commitment up front that this has to be fully integrated. It's meant to create a space where you can prove, and like I said, there's 3 pillars to my proposal, technical maturity. It actually has sustainable in terms of engagement, right? There's no point doing it in Fedora if you're not intending on building a community around it, right? And it has to be the third thing. Oh man, I'm drawing a blank right now. Right there, market fit. Like, does it actually solve a problem? So am I looking for? Do I have a particular technology in mind right now? No, because I don't want to build a process that assumes it's the right fit. I'm trying to build a process that's wide enough where people can be like, oh, I have an idea that's not really working in the current change proposal process, right? That needs a space to breathe. And I would like to try to use this process, and we can iterate together on making sure that the process is right. I'm not trying to build a 100% right process. I'm trying to build a framework that makes sense that we can get better at, so that we can be more experimental without committing up front, right? Because right now, you're talking about what you're saying with hyperscaler. There's a policy requirements are very tight because they're aimed at the full integration point and not at this space where we need to show that an idea can be sustained. What we know is right now, we know what we're able to sustain, and we know what we are burning out on because we don't have the commitments. What we don't know how to do is stand up an area and like, look, this is going to be low quality relative to the mature outputs. And we're going to have a call to action to people who want this to help sustain it so that we can get the resources that we can be integrated, and we can say that we can commit to it for 2 or 3 or 5 years, right? So when you say looking for a problem to solve, I think there's a problem to solve. It's just that you have to look at the history of false starts, of things that have sort of not gone well, or things that people feel are too difficult to do. That's the problem space.
Right. We do need to have a place where we can fail. I
Right.
Absolutely agree with that.
And this is my proposal on how we can build a space where we can fail, but we have very explicit requirements so that we're limiting goalposts moving right at every point, and we have exit ramps. So failure in one way, like in the case of, there may be a technology that Red Hat wants to attempt to integrate and build a community around, right? But ultimately they can't. But it's still enterprise thing. It's still the thing that they want to support. They can exit out of this process and still integrate it into RHEL before it gets fully integrated into Fedora. And they've proven, they've made the effort, and then they know it's not sustainable, and that's okay, right? We just haven't committed to the Fedora project to fully ingesting that, right? And then I can see community aspects. Like, I would love this to work for Neil's. Like, I would love for Neil to have a communicated 5-year plan and have a space where people can work with him in the community along those plans and get there, right? I would love to offer something similar to other downstreams who would maybe like to work with inside of our boundary, and they currently can't, right? But I don't really have but the process we have right now is too difficult for them to have a place to experiment and show that this is a way forward that can be integrated. So,
okay, so we're up to 7 hands now. Before Troy, are you part of this thing, or is your hand up for something unrelated?
It's both related and unrelated. I have 2, and my questions are fairly short. and you can decide whether. My first question is, this is probably more for Scott, and I'm going to say them both. Don't answer right. My first question is, why not ELN, Fedora ELN? And the second one for Jeff is, I don't see this as actually fulfilling the business model that Scott talked about, because anybody could do this, not just RHEL. And then the business partners still don't know, is this something going into RHEL and not? An example would be if I wanted to do phones, Fedora on phones. I'm pretty sure RHEL doesn't want to do that, but maybe I could go through your thing. So those are my two questions. So
I can actually answer those if you want.
sure.
The Fedora on phones one is actually quite interesting. And think about this from the BU side. Say a random partner with a big budget of money decided to invest in building Fedora phones because they were going to build a phone. The RHEL BU may react to that and go, maybe we could build phones for enterprises. They're building community phones. So let's build some enterprise phone or some other angle that like is slightly different. It would give us the ability to react to that potential market problem in a different way if there was another community member building something like that. So like that would still be useful to Red Hat customers to react to. I've had customers tell me this, by the way. They're like, I don't care if the thing even makes it into RHEL. I just want to see what potentially could get there based on like what's mature. And to answer your second question, you actually nailed what refinement looks like in general. Like refinement in general, whether you're doing a feature or market problem or anything else, there's this weird nebulous process that happens. And I think it happens in Fedora, it happens in RHEL, it happens in CentOS Stream, where you're like, oh, like one person had this great idea. Three people jumped on it. Oh, that's more interesting. And now, like, as it gets through these sort of gates, you go, that now gets to that place where I mentioned it's something that the business could react to. Any business, not just the Red Hat business, but other business could also react to and go, it would actually be easier to build on Fedora than to start our thing from scratch. That becomes something that people can react to, and I think is a healthy thing for the Fedora ecosystem. I will add one last tiny thing. Yes, we did think about this in the context of RHEL because that's what we were doing. We were doing RHEL planning, but I would say Jeff and I both have an instinct or had an instinct. Immediately we heard that, we thought about this and everybody was talking about it. We're like, but this would be good for Fedora completely separate from RHEL, right? Like we did have that instinct. So like we were like, oh, we should take this to the Fedora community. Like that was our instinct, I would say.
I feel like since I was named, I should speak. I will say that we need to cycle back and look at the market problem with the iteratively now and make sure it still makes it. I still think it does, but that's why we're here. That we're doing this in a more open way because this is going to get us more input, right? So I will say why not ELN? ELN integration could be a possible output that I haven't put into the feature proposal because something could go through the sandbox and go through curation. It may not actually be appropriate to integrate in Fedora, but it may have an exit into ELN. That may be something that we discover is an appropriate exit path for when it's a Red Hat vendor technology.
ELN is Fedora, and I will die on this hill.
There may be some policy changes that need to happen as we move through the process a couple of times, right? But regardless of that statement, I can see other technologies from other vendors who use Fedora as an upstream, getting to the point where they've sandboxed it, curated it, for whatever reason, it can't be fully integrated. They may have an exit that exists in their downstream, right? There are other downstreams that use Fedora that are vendor outputs, right? So I want this process to be big enough to include community interests, other vendors, right? And it's real so that we have an exit point if we need it for technologies that are material for the vendor outputs, right? They made an effort to go through the Fedora process, and for whatever reason, we can't get there, right? We just be clear about that, and there's an exit into their vendor process if they need it. But I want to close the loop on the vendor stuff so that we give everybody a fair chance to experiment and try to integrate in a path forward there.
Okay. Steve Milner, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll make this pretty quick. Generally, I like the idea. We actually have something like this to a much smaller degree today in Fedora called CommuniShift. It's specific for like hosted services and applications though. So it's not the same, it doesn't have the same depth of process, nor does it have, you know, the same technological focus of kind of anything that would move forward. I'm not going to say we weren't successful with it, because I think we are successful with it, but I think it could have been more successful and can be more successful. The biggest issue is in the marketing and getting people to jump in or use those types of things. So I think it's great for us to provide these types of processes, and I think it's the right thing to do personally. But you know, we have to make sure we can't just build it and say great people will show up and do things, because that's not been my experience. We need to build it, and then we need to go in front of people, right, in the community, partners, your friends, etc., and say, please check this out, and keep on that if we want this to work out. So that's it.
David.
So I'm wondering if we are not overlooking some of the things that we already have in Fedora that could help us here. For example, the product requirements documents, which I think I keep coming back to for a statement, is like, from the context of the edition, it seems like that's a place where we have some common ability to organize and develop our critique. It's like kind of the point at which we meet, where the askers and the sellers, or the bidders and the sellers, kind of get to the same spot.
That could be David. Alexandra, what do you think?
I think we're a bit mixing several contexts in this conversation right now. So there's one is about like, how do we communicate features and so on, and the other is how do we develop them, and the third is like, how do we make the process more open. And from that perspective, I feel like I like this concept of providing experimental grounds, but it like brings a lot of overhead, and I feel like we shouldn't use that approach just alone. We should say there is a certain hierarchy of ways how you interact with Fedora and how much freedom you get when interacting with Fedora, and that like heavyweight approach with this proposed framework would be like one of the lowest layers on that list, and it will only be used if none of the things above worked. So when we say why not ELN, it's like, can it be done in ELN? If I'm saying, like, my favorite example now, because I'm doing the installer web UI, is like, my installer web UI needs to land somewhere. I cannot land it into Fedora server right now because it's not ready yet. But I also don't want to make it live for a year in a branch, in a pull request, which I cannot actually integrate properly with the rest of the system and like survive on the test builds only. This will be disaster. So I'm thinking right now of blending that thing into ELN first, because the impact is smaller, the direction is clear that I want to go there, but I have like the explosion, like a blast radius is smaller, and so I can integrate there and iterate there before I actually land to Fedora server things. So I like the idea of having these experimental grounds, but for my specific feature of WebUI installer, I don't need that. I have other options, and I should always have answers to why haven't I tried ELN for this? Is there a reason? And if I don't have a good reason for that, I shouldn't go deeper into that framework layer, because it's too much overhead for a thing which can be done in a more simpler way. Same with like community shift approach. If my app just needs a OpenShift instance to run, like my bothy whatever Git implementation. I actually do not need to go through that like heavy lifting of things. I can just use whatever tools are cheap and available. But sometimes we hit something which is like, this is really something which doesn't fit into existence. And like ELN itself is an example of such a feature. Like when we had no ELN and then we proposed ELN, and the first thing we started like no one can maintain that or build that or whatever, and we had to build it completely on the side and have now a separate ELN team which works there, and it's like I created a branch in a project. So that's the level of initiatives which should propagate to that layer where we're talking about things which are completely independent. Modularity would be a nice example of such initiative which didn't happen. Conflux would be another initiative. So things which cannot use any of the above methods and need to be like using some different level of tools. So this is how I see it. Maybe Jeff can correct me.
Yeah, Jeff.
I'm happy. I would like nothing more than to be able to strip back as much of the overhead on the first stage of the life cycle as we can get to, so that it is as easy as you can, so that you have this as you can start thinking this process as oh, I can do this really simply. I constructed it with a heavyweight because like I feel like it's easier to strip back than to add, right? So if we can, as a group, we can make this commit, like we like the lifecycle concept. We need to make the sandbox easier to get into. I am happy to just push that to make it as easy as we can conceivably get it. Part of that we have to, the next phase of this would be like, we have to start talking about what a standard sandbox looks like, because that way, if we can get to that, then I think we can address exactly that concern that this is a heavyweight, right? Because if we can define a standard sandbox experience with standard exits, standard anticipation, standard timescales, all that, and it makes sense for you right now to just grab a standard sandbox without having to intersect with FESCO. You just make a commitment to those commitments that we expect from a sandbox user. Then maybe that is all you need, right? But I want this process to be big enough so that when you have something big that needs to have different conditions that need to be agreed on at the outset, we have a process that can handle that. But I would love nothing more than to have a boilerplate sandbox that we all agree on. And like, if you can live within this, you're good to go. You can just fire it up, and then we check in with you at 6 months or a year or whatever, right? I hope that addresses it. Like, this is meant to be this should not be the median experience. The median experience should be a simplified version of this.
Steph, at last, go ahead.
So at this point, I have two questions. The first one is more simple. What does someone get from doing this? In other words, if I was to make a change or work on something, why would I benefit from this process? And why would this make me choose Fedora over some of the alternatives? If I was leading a 5-year or 3-year technology incubation or whatever you want to call it, why would I use this? What would draw me to this? What would I get? Not what would I have to pass through, but what would I get?
Okay.
I was going to ask Steph, what are your ideas of what you would get? Because you're quite often propose what you want, but like, what would you propose that people get?
Okay, let me ask the other question. My other question, maybe it will provide clarity. What are the first 3 things that would go through this? And I'm not thinking about that abstractly or rhetorically, but why aren't let's identify 3 things and their champions and the people who would actually go through this and ask them, does this make sense to you? Do you get something from this process? Does it make you choose this over one of the other communities? And are we putting this together in the context of people who want to do this? Like, what are they? What are those first three things that were in mind as we wrote this down?
Well, let me
And
answer
who are the people behind it?
I'll answer the first question first. If you don't see the value in getting to fully integrated with Fedora, right? Then I don't know how to answer the question. Because ultimately,
well, because open source does all of these things at a different layer of abstraction. And so,
right. But
what does someone gain from just not using open source methodologies or other alternatives over this?
This is open source methodologies do not guarantee, and nor does this process guarantee integration into Fedora. Right? So you either have to value that it's worth the time to integrate into Fedora as a technology, or you don't. Right? This process doesn't speak to that. That is a you have to want to integrate to interact with the project, right?
Right, but people have done things like so I guess on the first question again, people have integrated technologies into Fedora many times already, and I'm not saying it was great, but we should identify what they get out of this versus the way that they've done it before. And we should know what are those first three things so that we're not completely working in the abstract here.
So
what are the three things we should see to take this on?
I would argue that things integrate with Fedora, but not necessarily set up to succeed in a sustainable way, right? So yes, technologies can get to integrated, and then a year later, or 2 years later, or at some point, they don't have the people anymore to sustain that, and it becomes a drag, right? And these are a lot of false starts. There's some false starts in the history here, right? And so the intent of this process is to focus on, if you value integrating with Fedora, this process should help you have a sustainable integration, so that we are making sure we're looking at not just technology maturity, but you do have some community sustainment there, right? Which is not something that we have as part of process at all. There's no recognition right now, for example, when a SIG is trying to put a technology out, that 2 years later, that's a sustainable effort. They just sort of erode, and we don't have any focus to make sure that before we consider it fully integrated, or even after it's fully integrated, that there are health checkpoints on things like that. And part of the structure of this is to provide explicit commitments, explicit expectations that we're going to review that, and there are exits. And more importantly, you go back into the curated stage where we are able to use friendly expert resources. Like I want OSPO to be part of the curation process. And I've talked to Jason already a little bit, where, if we're falling down on community engagement stuff, OSPOs are experts around collaboration and the open source process. We should be able to bring them in and get that thing back up to the point where we feel like, yes, this is a sustainable part of the of the Fedora project, right? When I talk about market fit, like I'm thinking very specifically about Red Hat technologies, right? Knowing that when you get to curated, it could be a mature technology, but it may not have market fit. And we need to know that, because if it's going to be a vendor-backed thing primarily, then that's part of the assessment of, is this maintainable? Because if there isn't market for it, and it's a vendor-backed technology that doesn't have community sustainment, then it really needs to have market fit, right? Or it's not going to be sustainable a year or two later, right? So the whole point of this process is to think about, at every stage, what are the exit criteria that we allow ourselves to agree to, so that if we don't meet those requirements, then it's something that we allow ourselves to stop doing, right? And be honest about it. So that also, but by doing that, that creates a space where we can be experimental because we don't have to upfront all the requirements. We can build this space where like, this is a little gross, but it's a space where people can work on it together so that by the time you're ready for integration, we all feel confident that 3 years from now, this is still a thing, right?
So,
Jeff, do you mind if I just 10 seconds give some of the projects that were mentioned in the market problem that we were thinking about running through this?
Sure.
So one was Ramalama. That was one that got discussed. So like an AI stack thing that is not that mature yet, but people want to know, could it get more mature and it would be useful? We went back in history and dug through like Podman and Podman Desktop would have been useful to run through this process because it would have given the world some sense of how mature they are and how tightly coupled they are to Fedora. There's a bunch of red hat research projects that are coming out of Chris Wright's team. Project Hummingbird would have won one that would have been interesting to run through this, to be very honest. There's something mentioned with AWS Cloud Insights. I don't know what that is, but I know what, I just use an AI summary of the market problem, but like the gist was, imagine a cloud provider wants to make something in the Red Hat ecosystem work better in their environment. So imagine any cloud provider, right? It has like little tools and tidbits and bits and bobs that make their thing work better. Like understanding how mature that is in the Fedora space would definitely like help everybody, right? Like it would help that cloud vendor, it would help Fedora, it would help CentOS, it would help RHEL, it would literally be a win-win-win. That's a perfect example of one that would be like multi-vendor, multi-people, multi-community people that helps everybody that's involved and makes the entire ecosystem function as a whole. I think that one to me is the lightning rod one that you'd want, right? Like imagine Linode hypothetically wanted to create something that works and they could mature it in the Fedora process and be like, oh, this is mature enough now that like anybody that builds off of this could use this, right? So any Linux that's built off of Fedora. I think those are the kinds of things that we were thinking about.
So I'm going to jump in here, moderator's prerogative, and say, gosh, Fedora is like over 22 years old now. Like Fedora can buy alcohol in the US. It's been around for a long time. And there have been lots of ways of onboarding things into Fedora, but there hasn't been really a rigorous adjourning process. And so I understand this proposal as a complete life cycle aspect that is trying to lower the barrier to entry, but also lower the barrier to exit, because exit is something we're not good at. And after a couple decades, we have a lot of accumulated things that got started and people finished, but you wouldn't know that they finished just by looking at it. It's still all out there. And so we have a lot of mess, and that makes it really hard for people to engage. It makes it really hard to know what's current and what's not. It's hard to get into the Fedora zeitgeist if you haven't been here all along. So this seems like a solution to that. Alexandra, I noticed your hand shot up in the middle of Jeff answering Steph's question. I wanted to check and see if you had an additional thing that you wanted to add to this before we move on to Davide.
Yeah, I actually wanted to comment on this because I think I may be incorrect, but I got the question from you is that you were basically asking, does this give me a reason to come to Fedora? I think this is not the correct to ask, because this process is applied when you all have some reason to integrate with Fedora, but you are being scared, not sure how to. Sorry, I will try again. So this process as a tool, it's not the point. You are coming to cause Fedora has such a process. You're coming to Fedora for something better.
Alexandra, let's do this. Could you type that, and we'll jump back to it after you've typed it, and we'll have Davide go while you're doing
that. There's been a lot of discussion here. I agree with pretty much everything that Alexandra and Steph said. I think having an additional process can make sense, and we can quibble on what the specific of the process should be, but I think we already have actually quite a lot of process in Fedora for introducing new things that, generally speaking, I think is working as designed. Like I think Stephen mentioned ButterFS earlier. ButterFS was introduced in Fedora 33 with a change proposal, and we worked through the change proposal, and it was fine. like as contentious as that was, and like I remember the mailing list thread for that and all of that around it, it was fine. Like I think that was a good example of the process working as it should have worked. I'm not entirely convinced that if the sandbox thing as existed back then, it would have made this materially different. I think there's a conversation to be had in what can we do to advertise better. This is a new innovative thing we're doing in Fedora. This is something we're playing with. And then this is something innovative we did that we shipped. I think we absolutely should do a better job at that, and that's valuable. And I think a process like the sandbox could make sense for like wide infrastructure revolutionary things. Like Complex, I think, is a good example of something that could have gone through something like this because it touches a lot of subsystem, it touches a lot of things. It's not really something you can try out and do as part of like just a simple change. But like the examples you mentioned, Scott, I don't think Podman, for example, would have made sense here, because Podman at the end of the day is it's like a package. And like, yeah, it touches a few things, but like, I don't think this would have needed this heavy weight of a process. Likewise for Ramalama, maybe I'm missing something here, but I don't feel like either of these will need this heavy weight of a process. The other thing I would say is, even if we go through all of these, there is no guarantee that people will actually keep maintaining things. Like at the end of the day, this is a volunteer project. Everybody working on Fedora works on Fedora as volunteers, even the people that are on the payroll of Red Hat or Meta or whatever. Like, you can't assign work to volunteers. If I come up tomorrow with a proposal of, and this is a preposterous example on purpose, but let's say I come up with an initiative to like make Fedora with the herd kernel instead of a Linux kernel, and we go to the sandbox process and we ship it. Unless I, as the project like proposer, commit to having people and resources to keep this going in the future, I can't really expect random people in the community to pick this up and maintain it. And there's no guarantee that I won't disappear tomorrow and that I won't keep maintaining it. So I don't know that this actually addresses that specific concerns. It does add a lot of process around it, but like, we don't have any enforcement there, because we are not a company. Like, we are a volunteer project at the end of the day. There's other things I had, but in the interest of time, I'll let people go.
Yeah, double time. Justin, go.
Yeah, one thing that I was waiting to hear if it was going to come up or not, and didn't quite hear in the conversation, is kind of, I have two kind of main points of feedback, was around the community organization side of this, as well as replacements of kind of existing messaging and resources that we already provide in this sandbox-like idea. So to me, when I was listening to this call, the biggest thing that stood out to me is that it sounds like there's a desire to better understand like what the popular or emerging or growing innovative things are in Fedora, and having some way to get that community validation as those things are getting momentum or growing or becoming popular. But to me, we do have a lot of disparate, like disconnected pieces around this model of having a framework of change for newer and bigger ideas. One of those, of course, is on the release cycle level, is changes. There's not a larger messaging, though, that connects those changes to bigger themes across releases. We do have community initiatives at the council level, where you actually can get resources and deep connection time with the Fedora Council governance as a community initiative lead, and those typically run for 12 to 18 months. And then and actually it was great that Steve mentioned about Community Shift. We actually do have these resources in Fedora infrastructure proper that provide a sandbox-like environment for people to build out and test their new ideas, especially if their goal is like final integration into something in Fedora infrastructure. That might not always be the case, and that's okay. But for some people, that's a resource that might be extremely interesting or valuable. And we don't really do a lot of connecting between changes, community initiatives, and Community Shift. And I think it's interesting that the sandbox proposal feels like it's trying to bring a lot of those things, like create a new framework to make, have that community validation of change. But I think we have a lot of mixed messaging that's already on the field around how we've tried over various years to promote these key, processes and resources, but we've never really connected them together. So to me, like on the replacements point, Sandbox seems like it's either overlooking these, or it needs to be a larger framework of change that includes some or all of these things. On the community organization side, like, to me, there was also like part of the AI conversation too, is like, I think there's also a lot of interest in having experimentation around these things. And, to me, I think it'd be really interesting to have conversations around how having AI could be useful for these things, either by providing some kind of access to our contributors, to have access to some kind of public model, or also being able to connect people who are driven and motivated to succeed, contributors, to the resources that they need for success and support. I think, like, to me, like, the last thing is that, like, the first foundation of Fedora requires that, like, we're going to have lots of many new competing ideas all at once. Like, that's always going to be part of what we're doing as a project. The features foundation is always, pushing us to deliver the best of what open source has to offer, which ties into the Freedom Foundation. And we're doing this all together with our peers, our friends, the Friends Foundation. So I think, like, we should focus Sandbox on what actually allows visibility into these various tiers of success and momentum. And I think, there is some interesting stuff that the CNCF has done around this. Maybe that's a model we can, like, try to be, like, to fork into our own format, if that's something that makes sense. And if that's what we're trying to get insight into, could be like a Fedora incubator. But one thing we need to think about whenever we're creating something like that is that we're probably going to need to have mentoring resources. We're going to need to have milestones with success criteria. It probably should be fixed term, so there's a period of, like, clear onboarding and clear offboarding. But those are the kind of things I would like to see incorporated into the Fedora Sandbox discussion. Like, and I think that would help make sure that we're cleaning up behind us as we go with all this, like, past messaging that we've done and invested into at various historical links of how to drive change in Fedora, how to do your thing. Over.
Thanks, Justin. David, go ahead. I'm going to launch a poll at the same time for next week. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, I mean, I do see a tremendous value here in places where you're actually making a commercial decision, right? I mean, I can say that there are projects that I think don't have immediate value for us in the upstream or in the down, as an upstream project, and may have value for Red Hat as a downstream project, but ultimately they lead to something that might be better preserved in the face of knowing that we had, there was some stasis around. Very specifically, I know that internally, I've been bombarded with questions around how we can create different kinds of tagging models, right? So for example, from within DNF, which represents like a giant modification in the way that things are handled, or semantics, right, around the tool. And the only place that could exist, right, as a we're doing this in the context of Fedora, right, would be somewhere in something like a sandboxed environment, right? I see. And I so I mean, maybe I'm missing the point of the focus, but like we're gonna end up in a position where we're either fostering things that will never have a place in Red Hat, right? And maybe have a place in the tools, or we're doing something that is fundamentally important for unifying the rest of the projects that are associated with Fedora, right? So all of our if we're not moving towards something that is bringing us together, we are moving towards something that is effectively an upstream process, and we don't necessarily belong there except as a facilitator.
Okay, so Dominic, can we take this to Matrix?
Sorry, I can't type on this thing because I don't have a keyboard on this tablet. Just a very quick thing. After reading what Scott wrote in the chat, I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding here where, like, the way I read the thing that Jeff posted was a process for getting changes integrated in Fedora. And to me, it read very much like something targeted to infrastructure changes. What you are talking about, Scott, is effectively having a place that open source projects that start as unrelated to Fedora can mature and integrate in a home that's adjacent to Fedora and leverage the resources that Fedora provides, but grow as projects. These are two very different things with almost no overlap, in my opinion. I think what you want, Scott, is effectively an incubator. Like, you want a space that projects can do their thing, they can have some resources, they can have a repo, they can have maybe a fast path to get something shipped alongside the distribution, like via Copper or whatever, and then they can have a channel to communicate and get feedback and get input from the community. That makes a ton of sense to me, and we could totally do that. And that seems fairly straightforward to do, and I think it would be beneficial. I don't see how any of this relates to the proposal that's currently on this course, though. Like, I think these are two very different and disconnected things. And like, we can certainly talk more, but that's, like, thanks for writing that in chat, because that clarified a lot for me on what you actually want to get here.
All right.
Yeah, that explained it. And also, like, I was thinking, Davide, for like the SIG that you're in, like, it feels like that's the exact same business problem you have, right? Is making that cloud SIG mature enough that people perceive it as real. Like, that's kind of the same problem I'm thinking. That was my perception of what I was thinking.
Scott.
Yeah, that makes way more sense now. Thank you.
Okay. I would love to take this conversation further, but do it async in Matrix chat. So
yeah.
I want to thank everybody for the discussion today. Clearly, the proposal is not clear to everyone yet, and we got to iterate some. So we'll take that feedback, we'll work it through, and I'll see you all online. Thanks all.
Take care all.